minutes, and then we'll have about 20
What are we
minutes.
supposed to be speaking about? What do you want us to say exactly?
Right.
Because we don't all want to say the same thing.
No, and I wanted to the others. So Sumaya's going to start on the reality of making this threat. Robert Light will be second on immigrant communities. We've got John's expertise here. I'd like you to finish on the virtues of dialogue and making most of the conflict. Why are we having these conversations? And how they may be difficult, they need to be had. But that's just off the top of my head. So please feel free to.
Okay.
In a sense, you have an advantage because
Come in last.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for this slight delay, but I think that we're all here and ready to start. So welcome to this debate. I'm Catherine Fieschi from Demos, and it's a real pleasure to be here this year at Islam Expo. We're here to talk about, well, the debate is entitled The Islamist Threat, Myth or Reality? This is a topic that all of us here on this panel are particularly interested in, and it's a topic that we're particularly glad to be discussing here today. The way into this debate is that we thought that Demos hosting this debate here at Islam Expo was an obviously good thing to do. Yesterday, across various blogs and across various parts of the media, we were asked to pull out or be denounced in the national press, at which point we decided that this was a challenge that we were really happy to rise to, and that obviously we weren't going to pull out, and obviously we were going to be here this afternoon with this very distinguished panel to have this discussion. Thank you. Martin Bright was supposed to be on this panel, and he's asked me to convey his apologies to the panel and also to make sure that it was known that he thought it was a good idea for Demos and for all of us to be here. His absence is due particularly to the issue that he has with the libel action that's being taken against Harry's Place. It's a protest specifically for that. So, given that we're here, given that we've not pulled out, given that we will be denounced in the national press, and frankly I look forward to it, it's my pleasure to introduce this debate. Why are we here? Well, we're here to discuss what we think is actually an incredibly important issue, which is essentially whether we are living in a world that has constructed a myth about an Islamist threat, or whether in fact there is some reality to this. More importantly, we're here to acknowledge the fact that this is an incredibly contentious issue, that there are very complex strands within Islamist thinking and action, and that we need to have this difficult conversation. So here we are. I have a very distinguished panel with me, and we're going to start, first of all, with Sumaya Ghanouchi, who you all know, who is a frequent contributor to The Guardian and to Comment is Free, and who, in fact, yesterday wrote an article particularly on this issue of the threat being a myth or reality. I was interested to note that it was referred to in The Guardian as the Islamic threat, whereas we obviously have labeled it the Islamist threat. So I'm interested in that distinction, and in starting off with you, Sumaya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I think I speak for everyone, or many of you here today, when I say that every time I open the papers and throw them aside, or switch off the TV or the radio without hearing or reading the word Islam or Muslims, I breathe a deep sigh of relief. But unfortunately, these instances of comfort and relief are growing rarer and rarer by the day. If the programs or the the articles don't carry anything on Sharia, then they will have something on Muslim women and their subordination. If not, then it's immigration, integration, multiculturalism, citizenship, or any of the above sometimes. I mean, sometimes I think that the only way of escaping this dreaded subject is to turn into a hermit, which sometimes when you look at the press, doesn't seem like such a bad course of action. I think the problem is that within this, the current climate of tension and mutual distrust and mutual suspicion, it's becoming increasingly difficult to hear the voices of reason, to see issues analyzed objectively and deeply and rationally. And what seems to make matters worse is that this endlessly reproduced material, chronically flawed material about Islam and Muslims is consumed by a public whose knowledge of Islam and understanding of the complexities of the issues facing the Muslim world is at best limited. Of course, there are honorable exceptions, and we're very fortunate today to have many of them here with us. But I'm talking about the mainstream. I'm talking about the dominant narrative, which by converging with the positions assumed by the centers of power and influence, start to inhabit or to occupy the so-called mainstream and turn into the dominant narrative. And they don't like to be challenged, and they don't like to be questioned. And as our chair noted, we should have had Martin Bright with us this evening, but unfortunately he chose to withdraw. The trouble with the Martin Bright and the camp he represents is that they want to impose their own narrative on us all. And they want to impose the terms, they want to impose the parameters of the discussion, and whenever you are to engage in this discussion, you have to adopt their own narrative. And there's a serious problem with that. And we have a distinguished panel with us today. We have experts and leading authorities on the subject. But unfortunately, Martin Bright and many people like him refuse to engage in an open, healthy, and rational and objective discussion about a very complex issue. And they want us to keep this subject, they want us to become a taboo, they want us to monopolize the subject and to impose their own narrative of the subject on us all. And that's very unfortunate, and I believe that's a big part of the problem. I think we wouldn't be exaggerating if we said that Islam today is both the religion that is closest to Europe and remotest from it. Muslims have never come closer to Europe than they have done in the last few decades. But it seems, I think there's a very intriguing paradox here. Muslims are part of Europe today. They're not an alien body. They're woven into the very fabric of British and European society, but their physical proximity doesn't seem to have made them any closer, any more familiar, or any better understood. If anything, they seem stranger and more distant than ever. But I suspect that all this talk about the Muslim threat or the Islamist threat must make many strategists and military experts roll with laughter sometimes, because threats are not founded on anxieties or mere illusions or on psychological fears, but on hard, concrete military and political facts, on how much conventional and non-conventional military technology you have, how many war fleets you possess, how many nuclear heads. And let's face it, when you look at the issue from this angle, the Muslim world is rather insignificant. Militarily and strategically, and not only insignificant if we compared it with the US or Europe to a lesser extent, the great powers which are bristling with the latest technology, military technology and military weapons. But even if we compared it to lesser powers like China or Russia or India, or even if we compared it to South Africa or Taiwan, And I find it rather laughable that we should be discussing the Muslim or the Islamist threat when in the last 7 years alone, 2 Muslim countries have come under direct military occupation, when we had all thought that this bleak episode of the world's history was long behind us. And without even talking about the other Muslim countries which have been under military occupation for decades, places like Kashmir, like Palestine, or like perhaps the Golan Heights, part of Syria. I mean, the Muslim world of threat, sadly not. It's not a threat. Give me a break. It can't even defend its territories. And now let's come to Al-Qaeda. Let's talk about Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. Do these pose a strategic threat to Europe and the United States or the so-called West? I don't believe that there's a monolith called West, just as I don't believe that there's a monolith called Islam or the Muslim world. No doubt, I believe that Al-Qaeda does pose a threat, but not a strategic threat, a security threat. And it is a security threat shared, faced, both by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. After all, Al-Qaeda bombed more in Bali and Casablanca, in Riyadh, in Algiers, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Tunisia, more than it did in London, in Madrid, or in New York. So Al-Qaeda is a security threat which needs to be dealt with through the intelligence services, but not a strategic threat. It doesn't amount to strategic threat, let alone a threat to Western civilization. It's a security threat faced both by Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and I believe more so by the former. It seems to me that the general rule when dealing with the subject of the Muslim world and the Middle East is to rely on as much imagination and myth as possible, and as little fact and evidence as possible. I hate to say it, but the vast majority of what gets said and written about the subject is still chronically flawed, characterized by a trio of generalization, reductionism, and simplification. Take, for instance, the narrow and highly distorted lens through which the Muslim world is being viewed, and the highly reductionist set of terms and references through which the wide Muslim scene is approached. Terms like radicalism, jihadism, Islamism. The whole Muslim world is reduced to this endless list of isms which are being legitimized by a daily staple of images of shouting mobs, froth-mouthed clerics, and terrified Muslim women peering behind burqas. Today, these terrifying images make up the lens through which the wide Muslim world, through which tens of events, developments, movements, phenomena across the wide Muslim world are being viewed. But does this mean that there is no such thing as Islamic terrorism or extremism, and no crimes, no violence committed in Islam's name? No, it doesn't. Of course, there is such a thing as Islamic extremism. It does exist. The problem is with the tendency, willful or otherwise, of looking at the whole scene through these deformed expression, at looking at the whole landscape with all its colors, its shades and tones through the lens of Al-Qaeda. And the trouble is that we are dealing with a complex issue, with a complex reality, armed with a very narrow and disfigured and flawed terminological arsenal, which perpetuates the original state of ignorance, misleads rather than informing, and distorts rather than explaining. So we have talked about the problem. Now let's try and talk about the ways out of the problem. So what is the first step, you might ask, to attaining a better, more balanced and more coherent understanding of the Muslim world? I think the first step is to try to rely on look at reality rather than the way we would want reality to be. Maybe a lot of what happens in the Muslim world doesn't appeal to us. Maybe we don't like what we see there, developments there. But this is not enough for us to dispense with the need for us to understand it, to understand the issues as objectively and rationally as possible. Maybe we don't want to see Islamist oppositions, let alone Islamist governments, with their demands for autonomy and national sovereignty, just as we didn't like the national liberations movements before them, the nationalists before. I mean, you know, I think Mossadegh of Iran wasn't exactly a hit in the British press, and neither was Nasser in the 1950s and 60s, or indeed Boumedien's Algeria. Algeria's Boumediene. But that is not the point, you see, that's beside the point. Our likes and dislikes are beside the point. Like it or not, those movements are there. They are real expressions of real problems and real demands on the ground which we have to deal with. And whether we like it or not, our likes and dislikes do not change anything about the way things are on the ground. And the second step, I think, is to try to free ourselves of the ahistorical and abstract view of the region, as though whatever happens there is not capable of rationalization or logical analysis. Events, developments, and trends there tend to be cloaked with an air of strangeness, like mysterious aliens that defy any attempts at understanding. And this tendency is at its worst, I believe, when dealing with the issue of political Islam. Because not only do you have the word political, with all that it invokes, the associations, the political problems, and the political demands of the region, but you have the word Islam as well, which is seen as the pinnacle, the embodiment of deformity. So you have double the trouble, double deformity. You have these political demands framed within an Islamic framework. I think the problem is that rather than being analyzed, these phenomena, analyzed as historical phenomena, socio-political phenomena, analyzing them historically according to the laws of sociopolitics, we see them as ahistorical, metaphysical, irrational phenomena which cannot be dealt with objectively or rationally. And whatever is said or not said about the issue of political Islam, there is a number of facts which we must acknowledge. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. We have to realize that we're dealing with a very complex reality, a phenomenon that is so complex because it reflects the complexity of the different contexts within which this wide movement, this umbrella, which incorporates so much diversity. It incorporates the conservative and the liberal, the modernist and the traditionalist, the literalist and the rationalist, and even the modern and the postmodernist. And recently we have lost a great thinker, Abdul Wahab al-Masiri, who I would describe as a postmodern Islamist. And the second thing we have to realize is that political Islam is not a magical or metaphysical phenomenon outside the laws of sociopolitics. It is rooted in sociopolitics. In fact, it embodies many of many elements of continuity with trends, with major trends that came before it, such as nationalism. And perhaps during the discussion we'll talk more about that, the similarities between the thinking of nationalism and the brotherhood and many other similarities. Today, Islamist movements in the region are in reality as to the national independence predecessors in the region. They are the latest vehicles through which demands, aspirations shared across the region are expressed. They respond to the aspirations of vast sectors of their publics. And if we would rather not see things as they are on the ground, then I'm afraid that changes nothing about the reality and about the way things look on the ground. And let me conclude by saying that I think it is impossible to envisage a healthy, stable, and peaceful political life or any serious democratic transition in the region without the participation of Islamist movements. And why, you might think, am I so sure? Because this has been tried. For a long time, Arab governments have been telling us about and preaching the virtues of their strategy of democracy without Islamists and politics without Islamists. And the price they have paid in the security and stability of their countries has been high. Countries like Tunisia and like Algeria, and to a lesser extent like Egypt. The region and its successive political players have for decades been subject to an unrelenting game of demonization, which has only served to widen the rift between the Muslim world and the West. The leftist movements of the 50s and the 60s, we must remember, were demonized no less virulently than political Islamist movements are today. They were portrayed as part of a wide Soviet conspiracy. Nationalist movements like Nasserism were combated no less virulently than political Islam today, and the same mechanisms and methods are being used with this vast, popular, highly diverse political phenomenon. Why? Because, and here we come to the heart of the problem, I think, it is because we still insist to see the region in our image and at our service. Its existential role for us is to act as a vehicle to our interests. We refuse to recognize, so it's either a vehicle to our interests or an obstacle to our interests. And that's the test through which we measure the players on the scene. So we see that stretch of land and all that it carries through the prism of our interests. And you might say, yes, we should pursue our interests. But the trouble is there are legitimate interests and there are illegitimate interests, and some of our interests are illegitimate. And we have to recognize that just as we have our interests, the other side has its own interests, and only by recognizing that fact can we have a balanced and stable and healthy relationship. And to end, I will say that, in my view, the phenomenon of political Islam is said to remain active and influential across vast sectors of Muslim society for decades to come, just as, by the way, leftist and nationalist movements had done before. And the options before us are not many. They're rather limited. We can either acknowledge this reality for the sake of common interests based on compromise and pragmatism, with a view to guaranteeing the interests and needs of both parties involved, or we can push for deeper crises. And if we do that, we will all have to pay the price in this globalized world where everything is interconnected, and that includes friendly regimes, and it includes Western governments, and it includes Islamist oppositions alike. So we must be very careful when we fan the flames of crisis, because it's very likely that our fingers may get burnt too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumaya. You have an Irish interpretation of 2 minutes. I like that. I'm going to hand over now to Robert Lycan, who's Director of the Immigration and National Security Program at the Nixon Center in the US. He's also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he's currently writing a book entitled Europe's Angry Muslims. So I'm handing over to him now. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Catherine. Greetings. I want to thank you for the invitation that I've received to be here. It's a tremendous learning experience. I am just a learner in these matters. I began my interest having been involved in politics in Latin America and on both sides of the Cold War, having been a radical and then someone who was de-radicalized. And got to 9/11, and like many Americans were, after that happened, was puzzled. Who were these people who attacked us, and why did they attack us? America had never been attacked in the mainland. 3,000 people were killed, people who had nothing to do, who probably, many of them didn't even know what Islam was, certainly didn't have anything to do with American foreign policy. And so it was very shocking. And well, I anyway started studying this, and at a certain point, the answer that I received from conventional wisdom, I won't say conventional wisdom, many commentators, was that the terrorists, the people responsible for this were, first of all, it was clear that they were Muslims. They all said they were Muslims. They not only said they were Muslims, they said they were Islamists, and that they were the only real Muslims, and that the only correct thing to do as a Muslim was to wage jihad. Then the question became, well, how did this idea get spread around so that people believed such things? And the answer that I got from many sources was the Muslim Brotherhood. So I began to study the Muslim Brotherhood. I heard that the Muslim Brotherhood, I was told that they were responsible, but on the other hand, I started noticing that leaders of Al-Qaeda regularly attacked the Muslim Brotherhood for participating in elections, saying that they were worshiping false idols, saying that they were preventing people from the true course of jihad. So I began to study this a little more deeply with my research assistant. He went to the Middle East, to Egypt, to Syria, to Jordan. I went to Germany and France and Spain and to England. We talked with many Muslim brothers. We translated a book by Hudaybe, the Supreme Guide. We translated it into English. We looked at this very carefully and came to the conclusion that while there was a certain relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and this, a historical relationship, that the Muslim Brotherhood itself had rejected terrorism, global terrorism, back in the 1950s and 60s, and that many of those responsible had come out of the Muslim Brotherhood but had left it precisely over this issue. So we began to see that people who called themselves Islamists were not all jihadis, and that many of them, perhaps certainly most of them, were not. So that was a distinction we could make. We wrote an article explaining this, arguing that, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood had many so-called moderates. We were looking for moderates to talk with. Why don't we talk with the Muslim Brotherhood? Well, this was met with a very mixed reception. Surprisingly, very surprisingly, it was greeted rather favorably in some parts of the Bush administration. It was read by Condoleezza Rice. It was even read by George Bush, which caused us great surprise because some of us weren't sure whether George Bush could read. But we also, it was put on the New York Times website, it was cited, there were many articles written about it, and that was all fine. On the other hand, I began to receive a great deal of criticism, some of it ad hominem, directed at me, saying that I had done this for various nefarious reasons. A lot of websites attacked me, a lot of publications attacked me. My funding, one of my two funders informed me that they would not be continuing their support. So it was a tough situation. And I have to say the situation was made tougher by some of the things subsequently done by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. In January 2007, in Birmingham, I'm going to give you an example of the kind of things that have made it difficult to tell the story of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Islamists in the United States. A man by the name of Parvez Khan was arrested in Birmingham, plotting to kidnap a British Muslim soldier, Ghanaian. The plot was pretty far advanced. They were going to behead him. They were going to then make a video of this. They were going to make a video of the beheading and then show that on the internet to discourage Muslims from joining the army. Pretty horrible, kind of awful thing that was done in New York and Bali and a number of other places. A leading spokesman of the Muslim Brotherhood protested this arrest, saying that the people who were arrested were, quote, just individuals with loud voices who were vocal about various neighborhood issues, and that this was an example of the victimization of British Muslims. Well, Parvez Khan soon after that confessed. He was tried. There was enormous evidence presented against him. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. But my point is that this kind of reaction made it much more difficult because it made people say, well, the Muslim Brotherhood is defending terrorists. They must be terrorists. So the kinds of obscurantists, the kind of backward view that made no distinction between the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda was reinforced by this reaction of the Muslim Brotherhood. It makes it much harder for us to try to tell the true story. I think it's, I was very interested in the remarks I just heard. I agree with them by and large. I think it's true that Al-Qaeda is not a strategic threat. Perhaps it would become a strategic threat if the situation in Pakistan were to deteriorate further, and if Al-Qaeda was, someday to get a hold of the nuclear, or if it were to become an Al-Qaeda state and get a hold of its nuclear arms. But that doesn't seem, even then, it's not clear that would make Al-Qaeda a strategic threat. But obviously, it's some sort of a threat, whether we want to call it a security threat. The people who regard it as a threat are not making it up. We looked at the RAND database and looked at terrorist acts since the 1960s and found that they increased very sharply in the late 80s and the 90s when a new phenomenon developed, mass spectacular terrorism. The idea of not just, not like the IRA planting a bomb and then calling up and saying, clear out the area, but attempt to kill as many civilians as possible. And unfortunately, distressingly, this was done by people who claim to be Muslims. Now, I don't think you can really blame the newspapers for taking them at their word. They say they're Muslims, they say they're Islamists. This is a problem, and I think it's a problem that you people need to address. I think it's also a problem that newspapers need to address. There is a lack of objective scholarship. We tried to do objective scholarship, and we were criticized as being sympathizers of the Muslim Brotherhood. But there's a problem on both sides. Yesterday I was in Walthamstow. I'm writing a book called Europe's Angry Muslims for Oxford University Press, and I've been going to a lot of immigrant communities. Muslim communities. I was in Walthamstow yesterday talking to a very interesting group of people who were trying to de-radicalize and to convince people that that's not the right path without giving up Islamism, without giving up the basic tendencies or message of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, but saying, as the Muslim Brotherhood says, violence is not the path. But I was talking with one of the workers there, and we were talking about 9/11, and I heard for not the first time, but probably the 100th time, that actually 9/11, that the people in 9/11 were the leaders, he said. I think it was actually a code word for the Jews, had been told beforehand to leave, and therefore there was some connection there between the Jews and 9/11. I said to him, well, you mentioned the leaders. The New York director of the FBI was killed at the World Trade Center. So there is on both sides, not just one side, but on both sides, a kind of mythomania, creation of myths which are used to kind of shore up support. I think there's a lack of political courage on both sides, where we're not willing to tell the people we want to attract the truth because we're afraid they won't like it and therefore they won't support us. So I think we all need to be objective and courageous if we want to deal with this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Robert. My third speaker is John Esposito, who's Professor of International Affairs and Islamic Studies at Georgetown University in the US. He's also editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, the Oxford History of Islam, the Oxford Dictionary of Islam, and the Oxford Islamic World Past and Present. I think he knows something about Islam, according to this biography. So please, John, over to you.
Thank you very much. much. And in December, you'll be able to get the 6-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of the World of Islam. But in any case, I don't want to plug my books. With regard to the question about an Islamist threat, myth or reality, the answer is, and I'm not being academic here, and it's you've heard it in different ways from those that have spoken before. The answer is yes and no. There is an Islamist threat, and there are plenty of those threats out there, and we've seen that. On the other hand, there is not an Islamist threat, but why do people see it differently? And what are the basic perspectives? There are two basic perspectives on this. There are two schools of thought. One school of thought says that all Islamists are a threat. And so they basically say the Islamists that are a threat are not just the violent extremists and terrorists, but they're also the Ikhwan and others who may not have engaged in violence, who may participate within mainstream society in terms of being social and political movements, but they are wolves in sheep clothing. They are wolves in sheep clothing. So the basic line is that this is really just a tactic on their part. It's part of an overall strategy. That position is represented by a host of people, too many to mention, but certainly in the United States, Bernard Lewis, Martin Kramer, Rob Sataloff, Daniel Pipes, and one could go on and on and on. And then there's another school of thought, which says you have to distinguish when you talk about Islamist or Islamic movements between a minority that are a clear threat to the West, and even more so to the Muslim world, and a majority that are mainstream. The reality of it is, as the previous speaker mentioned, the reality of it is that what you really have here, or at least as I would characterize the situation, and then refer to something that the previous speaker said, is that you have a highly politicized situation, not only in terms of politics, but in terms of what I call the war of experts. The war of experts. And so the problem the general public has is that you look at these different camps and you say, gee, they all have what look like similar credentials. They're well educated, they have an expertise, or at least many of them do. But they're coming from different positions on this. And part of what we have to sort out is the why. I would argue that those who say that all Islamists are a threat don't have the empirical evidence for it. You see, and that's why they can say of large groups of Islamists, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. That's the way around it. Because what they're really saying is it's not that they've done anything yet. I mean, that always becomes, I mean, the classic line when it's funny, I bring the example up, but it just so happens that his daughter is sitting next to me. When Rashid Ghanouchi was running for office in Tunisia, and then when you had Ben Ali, not yet of happy memory, as with a number of Muslim rulers, it'll take a long time, but when Rashid Ghanouchi was still very much in politics, but Ben Ali had now kind of crushed the party, I was briefing the new ambassadors for Tunisia and Algeria. And there was another expert in the room, and he said to me, we know what Ghanouchi says, we don't know what he would do. And I said, but in Ben Ali's case, we know both. We know what he's done in spades, who he was with, who he overthrew, what kinds of acts he committed, and what does he say? I'm a Democrat. You know? And post that, as you know, he won by 99.9% of the vote. But that has dropped tragically to, I think, was it 92% or 97%? It was a very close race the last time. But in any case, this is part of the problem. And as absurd as that sounds, the logic of those who say all Islamists are a threat and who attack anybody who takes a different position is simply out there. And that attack is in real terms. It's in the media, it's on websites, it's in lists, and it generates all kinds of hate mail and death threats, etc. Okay. My nephew worked in the center that I direct, and my associate director came to me one day and said, Steve is too nervous to tell his uncle this, but he's nervous working here. I said, well, what's the problem? He said, you have him opening your mail, and he's afraid of what might happen to him physically if there's something in an envelope. So there are realities. Okay. Why do we have this problem? and where should we be going from here? There's a lot of background to this, but I'll do it very quickly. You have a modernization and development theory that many experts were trained in, that international relations was governed by, that basically said that modernization and development required the secularization and westernization of society. And so modernizing societies in the Muslim world were those who were on the path to secularization and development. Several decades ago, you have then the retreat from that path. Now, for those who are very secular-minded and can only see participatory government and therefore development linked to a certain kind of secularism and a marginalization of religion, this is a major problem. It is anti-development, it is backwards, it is a retreat to the past, and it is dangerous religiously and can be dangerous in terms of security and stability. And remember, governments are primarily concerned with their national interest, and in general, they equate national interest with security and stability. And so if security and stability comes from supporting authoritarian regimes, albeit that's okay, especially if you can then have access to oil, for example. But if you now have these religious folk, with the way in which this mixing of religion and politics is seen as a problem, then they see that as not only a potential but a probable threat to stability and security. The other is what I just mentioned, authoritarian regimes. We might not like what they're like, but as in the logic of the Cold War, in a sense, they may be bastards, but there are bastards. Pardon my language, but I'm from Brooklyn. And the reality of that is it means, we can count on them on the critical areas. And that's where Ben Ali and others say, you want us to help you on Palestine? You want us to prevent the growth of radicalization. Remember what Mr. Mubarak said after 9/11, pointing to the Ikhwan. You want them to come to power? With the clear implication, if they came to power, this would be radicalism and terrorism, not only within Egypt, but spreading throughout the region. And as a result, the US and many Western states have pursued that kind of policy. Now, the difference is that for several decades, we've seen Islam as a major force in politics. In the early days, it was easy to continue with that rhetoric before, if you will, bad Islamist, because it was seen as revolutionary Iranian Islam that was going to be spread. But again, what do you do when events in Tunisia and Algeria and Jordan take place, elections, and Islamists now prove to be players in the political system? And more importantly, what do you do after 9/11 when Islamists continue to be players in the system? In Kuwait, when you see almost this spread of Islamists, okay, let alone when you see Hamas winning in what outside observers said were free and fair elections. Then what do you do? And what you see the West doing, as it did with Algeria, is losing its nerve. The first President Bush, Assistant Secretary of State, had given a policy on Islam and politics, as it were, Ed Jarijian, which said that the American government was open to Islamists, non-Islamists, coming to power if it was through the democratic process, and as long as it wasn't one man, one vote, one time. But when Algeria's feast looked like it was coming into power, there was the test. What are you going to do? Same thing happened with Hamas. The only time that Martin Kramer ever had anything good to say about me and linked me with George Bush was immediately after the elections to say, look, you've had Esposito saying this kind of stuff, but now you've got George Bush. They're responsible for the election of Hamas. So the only time George, and by the way, Bush did not read your article. They put it on a DVD for him because it was a little easier with pictures. But in any case, that's a terrible thing to say. But my mother used to say of her 3 boys, I was the only one that she had to get books with lots of pictures, so I'm in the same league in order to get me to read anything. All right, now, what we then see is this presence of Islamists, this continued presence, and the reality of it is that people know in their gut it's going to continue. Why? Because governments that are authoritarian are getting more authoritarian, from Egypt to Uzbekistan. It's not going to change. And we know that there's now the new approach to succession, which is, daddy passes it on to son, and there are lots of rumors about how that might continue to play out. But they also know that when you have these authoritarian governments, there are no alternatives to the Islamist party. I remember in talking to one of your father's senior leaders in Tunisia, and he kind of laughed and smiled and said, if they opened up the system, we would have to compete more for those who follow us. In other words, he acknowledged that many were supporters, but others were people who were voting against the government. And any good analyst knows that for the foreseeable future in many parts of the Muslim world, that's not going to happen. Now, let me make one other major point and then bring this to some concluding comments in terms of, where do we go from here. The challenge is clearly that we have to learn to distinguish between those that are violent and an imminent threat and those that function within. But a key issue here is the whole question of when we talk about anti-Americanism, when we ask a question like, why do they hate us? Is it because of Islam? Is it the religion of Islam? You see, is that the key issue? The Gallup poll, in a Gallup World Poll of 35 countries, representing the voices of 1 billion Muslims, and yes, I will say it, summarized in a book called Who Speaks for Islam? What 1 Billion Muslims Think, has data on what Muslims think about democracy, Sharia, etc. But one of the points that it demonstrates is that significant numbers, indeed majorities of Muslims, don't have a blind hatred of the West. Muslims distinguish clearly between what I call B and B, not bed and breakfast, but Bush and Blair on the one hand, and other European leaders. It's very clear in terms of statistics and attitude. They distinguish clearly in the way they describe these other folks. So America is seen as arrogant, neo-colonial, fear of dominance. But it also shows admiration for the West, its technology, its rule of law, its civil rights, its freedoms. That is demonstrated there. And when you ask Muslims, therefore, about their grievances and their concerns, they are political grievances. The grievances are the denigration of Islam, but also major grievance, Western foreign policy, fear of intervention, invasion, dominance. The grievances, interestingly enough, among the potential radicals, not people who are violent, but those who believe 9/11 was justified, among the potential radicals, their major grievance, they more than even the moderates believe that democracy is the way forward. But more than the moderates, they believe the West will never allow that, unless it's the West kind of democracy. And so they're the ones that fear even more the dominance, the double standard when it comes to political participation in human rights. What does this then mean in terms of the future in policy? It seems to me that we have to move beyond double standards on both sides. And the way forward is, first of all, Muslim governments that are more authoritarian, that are using now in a very sophisticated way the democratic process to actually become more authoritarian. So you have governments that say, you want civil society? I was at a meeting of the World Economic Forum, and people said the way forward is civil society. So you had an Egyptian get up, representative, and a Jordanian, and they both said, oh, our civil societies, our NGOs have increased by so many numbers. You know, we used to have several hundred, now we have thousands. What they didn't say is that they have government-regulated, non-government organizations. Government-regulated, non-government organizations. Contradiction in terms. Or they have royal NGOs, as they're known in some parts of the world. Muslim governments are going to have to go for more power sharing, addressing more the issues of corruption. That's not going to happen with some of them. And that's where Western governments come into play. The way for change is not through military intervention. It's not through posturing military intervention and sanctions early on. The way to change is for Western governments to use the leverage that they have in their relationships, their significant aid, whether it's financial or military, and to, in fact, be careful about how that aid is used. There should be massive pumping in of economic and educational aid, and not allowing that to be siphoned off into military aid that is more often used not just against foreign intervention, but in domestic issues. It's going to be much more important for Western governments to walk the way they talk. I said when President Bush in the second term espoused greater democratization, I basically was against that policy. Because what I said was that policy is great as long as we realize the implications and we have to live up to it. But if we say we're going to promote democracy and then we don't, we simply feed. The same thing we're talking about, we're going to resurrect the Middle East peace process. If we resurrect it, but at the end of the day, we continue to take a policy that is not more balanced, we will merely feed the cynicism within the region. And so I think it's going to be very important with the next president that they move in that direction. And my final point to bring this to an end. She, by the way, is brilliant. She's learned how to say, in conclusion, and then at the end, and to say, and my final point. It gives you a lot of space. But my final point is a conclusion. We need to remember that secular authoritarianism is as bad as religious authoritarianism. Both result in what I call the culture of authoritarianism. If you have governments that promote a culture of authoritarianism, then when anybody comes to power initially, they will act undemocratically, even if they're coming to power in the name of democracy. They will have to cleanse the military, the police, etc. And they suddenly find that they have to stay in longer and longer in order to bring that process apart. In relationship to that, it also means that Islamists themselves have to walk the way they talk. That is, that Islamists have to be clear on their principles. And they have to be clear in condemning those, whether Muslim or not, who do not follow those principles. I don't just mean the clear thing of saying, oh, we're against what terrorists did. I mean of saying that all must abide, whether they are Western governments, Muslim or non-Muslim, by similar criteria. Criteria that have to do with self-determination, human rights, equal rights for women and minorities, and the reality of equality of citizenship. Thank you.
I felt a bit marooned as a chair. So
I know.
Far away.
And I deliberately didn't look at you.
Yeah, I know you did. from far away from my most loquacious speakers, but I have you close by, Alistair. My final speaker is Alistair Crook, who's a former security advisor to Javier Solana and also the founding director of Conflicts Forum. I also want to give a deliberate plug to Conflicts Forum magazine. It's right here in the front, so for those of you who are interested, it's going to be for sale after this session.
Cultures of resistance.
Cultures of resistance. Thank you very much.
I thought it was quite striking, a phrase used by the last speaker, and I'd like to take it up in what I say. He spoke about the West losing its nerve, although if you listen to all the other discourse, it seemed to be a very confident West about what the solutions were. But maybe losing its nerve is actually part of the key to this. There was in Washington, earlier this year, a conference, and they brought together the former chiefs of defense staff of the main NATO countries. And it was about looking at the future and how to deal with the threats facing the West. And at the end of this discussion, it was the former German chief of defense staff who summed up for all of these members of NATO, leaders of NATO. And he said, we cannot survive. The West cannot survive in a world that challenges its values, where unfortunately we are a minority and they are a majority. There is no alternative, but we have to reaffirm Western certainties in this field. He went on to say that the West must therefore employ an asymmetry of confrontation with its enemies. It must pursue surprise. It must must ignore sovereignty. It must use whatever weapons were necessary in order to defeat our enemies, wherever they are. Well, I particularly thought of this when our last speaker, John Esposito, was speaking about losing its nerve. Because in a sense, this sort of view actually reeks of fear and reeks of lack of confidence, rather than a confidence West. And I think that this is really at the core of the problem, because we've heard from some of the other speakers about the challenges, the threat to the West, and an attempt to make a distinction between mainstream Islamists who occasionally or partly use, I think the word terrorism was used, but I would prefer to use the form resistance in it. And then, of course, the Al-Qaeda groups. But of course, neither of these groups pose a challenge to NATO in the sense of an attempt or an effort to militarily defeat the West. Even Al-Qaeda is espousing not so much an attempt to bomb the West into defeat, to destroy the West militarily. What we're talking about is a different form of revolutionary consciousness raising. On the one hand, and the great distinction between groups like Hezbollah and Hamas is an attempt to pursue, through their means, to pursue, if you like, a revolutionary strategy that doesn't outpace its bounds, that stays within the ability, within the confines of public support, and carries the population with it. Whereas Al-Qaeda type of thinking is about shock and awe, changing people's perceptions at a stroke, unleashing anger, emotions that can overwhelm people and bring about political change at a stroke. But what the generals said, which is true, is that they face a challenge. But it's not the challenge of military defeat. Of course, there are people who have used violence, but it's not a threat to the West. But what is a threat to the West is a sense that there is a different vision of society that people are increasingly espousing, that somehow the Western vision, which has lasted so long, is no longer the vision by which people accept their future. That the Western vision somehow is becoming a little stale for people and past its sell-by date in terms of the, as the general said, the majority who look in a different way. So the challenge is one not so much just of bombs, of violence, or as we just heard it described in these terms, of terrorism. The real violence, in fact, comes about ideas. And of course, the ideas for a new vision, new society, new economic structures are actually the ones that I believe really does worry Western leaders and NATO more than anything else, because they feel they're not quite sure how to control us, how to manage it. A vision lasts as long as a vision lasts. And when it's over, it's over. And how do they deal with us? So what we have, in a sense, is exactly what we say. And the NATO general said, we must defend our certainties. We must defend the status quo. In other words, we cannot manage. We are going to refuse to manage the change. Changes that are already underway, underfoot in the region. We can see them, not necessarily generated by Islamist movements or others, but changes that are stemming from rising prices, falling incomes, from change that is natural and taking place in the region. However, we are stuck, in a sense, in our thinking with how to deal with managing this change. So we term it instead a threat, a violent threat to the West and a society. And I would say that this is a miscalculation. And therefore, how do you deal with this misconstruction of what actually we're facing? Two visions, different visions. One vision which is based around the organizational principle of individualism, and another one that sees progress through social and community cohesion, and sees that, if you like, as the litmus of progression, and which puts human values back at the center of society. Well, I have to say, the prospects for success are not that easy. Historically, colonial powers that are beginning, if you like, to lose their nerve, as John Esposito put it, are not known for making their concessions. They tend to cling to the status quo and to power ever more tightly. and determinately during this period until a number of factors can change it. Perhaps it's resistance. We saw that in South Africa, the growth of resistance taking place. Perhaps it's military exhaustion, which was also a factor in South Africa. Or perhaps, and this is the thing that changes Western policy in my experience far more greatly than reason or discussion or dialogue, I'm afraid, it is failure. Failure makes people begin to look and search in the bottom drawer for alternatives far more readily than if we were to sit down and to try and persuade Dick Cheney that he had got Islam wrong. So I think that what one has to look at, and we heard someone arguing very strongly that what we had to be involved was a de-radicalization of Muslims in Europe. Well, radicalization is perhaps not the word I would choose, but I think it's actually precisely what we have to do, is to open the debate to the real underlying problem, which is not simply the military threat to NATO. The underlying problem is differences of visions about how politics should be conducted, how society, the basis and the formation of society, what are the appropriate institutions? How do we get back to putting the human being back at the center of society and basing our society on human values rather than the dehumanized, commodified system that many feel is alienating them at the moment. So I would argue that actually part of the need for change comes from internal debate that actually addresses some of these issues. And I think it was quite striking that ultimately in South Africa, that this is what brought the change. There was a resistance, the ANC on one hand, but still the elite were clinging to the idea of special rights for white people in Southern Africa at that point. But what really also contributed to the change was when activists and also businessmen came to the elite and said, you know, maybe this vision has passed its sell-by date too. If we want to be here in 25 years, we need also to think of another approach. And I think it was this internal resistance. I don't mean an armed resistance, but an internal critique. Not simply for the sake of critiquing the society in which it was taking place, but this internal critique ultimately enabled South Africans to jump, if you like, the constraints of their own fears and their own thinking, and to find a way forward. And I think we need to look here for the same thing, how to help the West, if you like, jump over the constraints of its over-imagined fears and to find a new politics and a new solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all four of you, for these thoughts. We have 2 roving mics, and we have about 15 minutes for questions. So, if you'd like to, I'd like for you to ask questions. If there could be an interrogation mark at the end of your sentence, that would be great. And could you also tell us who you are when you get handed the microphone? There's a gentleman right there in the back. I'll take 3 and then give the panel a chance to respond.
My name is Frank Kelly. I'm an Anglican clergyman. 2 questions, one for Mr. Esposito and the other one for Alistair Crook. First question, Mr. Esposito, you've only made the briefest of references to the question of Israel-Palestine. It seems to me that it is virtually impossible. Yes, you mentioned the need for balance, but here we go to the heart of a foreign policy of the United States of America, which is outrageously biased in favor of a colonial settlement in Palestine. And unless this problem, this requires a revolution. Maybe it needs a new American Civil War to sort it out. But unless that is dealt with, I don't think you can deal with the key element of grievances or in the Islamist and indeed Islamic movement. The second point about Mr. Crook, I'm very interested in your having raising the question of vision, and I'm one of the people who do aspire to a different vision, a different vision of running society, a different spiritual dimension. But in this context, the example of South Africa, I'm not sure is one of the best, because the new South Africa has certainly not put a new type of human being at the heart of its life. Yes, there is no longer racism, but the new South Africa is just one state among all others. So I think if we want to have this new vision, we must go much further. And I want to say that the spirituality which must be a heart of it.
Thank you. Do I have a gentleman right across the aisle? Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Rizwan. It's a twofold question, and the governments you've talked about and the authorities, I mean, there's a lot of words you've used, and I'm not being ignorant here, but are very, very hard for people to understand. So it's a discourse which is perhaps should take place in Joe Blogg's terms. There's a lot of isms and organisational type words which sometimes are very difficult for people here on the platform to understand. The first question is, are Muslim governments or even non-Muslim governments not really realising their potential in terms of the Islamic stance, i.e. the prophetic ideals? The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came with a religion that was very clear for everybody to understand, and now those very governments are misusing that knowledge. They are not sticking to the way and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, even though the public, the countries that these Muslim governments rule, are practicing the religion, and that frustration may well be taking a new form. So in that sense, my question to the panellists, in particular Samia and John, is that shouldn't Muslim governments now really realise that the original teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, the original teachings of Islam, are universal, are eternal. They were peaceful at the time, and they deemed a lot of success at the time, and now that's fallen by the wayside. And likewise, shouldn't the Western powers also realise how much the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Islamic religion means to the people of Islam?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to give John, I'm going to start with you, a chance to respond.
Okay, so to both.
Yes, please,
okay.
Go ahead.
The first question, when I was a younger scholar, which would have been a long time ago, and I traveled a lot initially in the Muslim world, I was asked two questions. There were really three, but I'll just reduce it to two. I asked three, one I could answer, so I'm not going to get to that. But the two they asked me were to explain American foreign policy in the Middle East and to explain the Trinity. And my response to both was, both the divine mysteries in terms of the answer. And the bottom line is, you're right. That is a critical issue. And but the depressing side of it is, from my point of view, is that whether Obama is elected, and many of us hope that he will be, or in terms of the next American president, or McCain, on that issue, don't expect substantial change. On relations with the Muslim world, the broader Muslim world and openness, yes. And I'm a little concerned about Europe, given Sarkozy's policy and given some of the other changes. With regard to the other question, I think I can answer that as an outsider, as an academic looking in terms of the Muslim character. My bottom line on that would be that the majority of Muslim governments, whether self-styled Islamic or those that are more secular, none of them, that's not their primary concern. And they're not realizing that potential. And I think that's where they run into problems, certainly with their Islamically oriented, politically active or potentially active populations.
Robert, do you want to add something to that? The potential for change? No? Okay. Shall I hand over to you? Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to know if you had anything to add to John's analysis in terms of the US.
I think this is the most important election in in recent years in America, and I think there will be a major change in policy. I will agree with John. I don't think there'll be a major change vis-a-vis Israel, but vis-a-vis Muslim countries and vis-a-vis Europe, I think if Obama wins, there will be a major change for the good.
Thank you. Alistair.
Yes. There's always a danger in drawing a parallel in another conflict. But in fact, when asking about visions in South Africa, I was not trying to compare South African visions with the visions of Islamist movements. I agree that there's not a great deal in it. What I was talking about was a simple point, which was how do you go about change, managing change in a society? And I think the point was that so often change gets stuck. People equate, if you like, change with security threat, change to being a depressing and pessimistic view. It's been quite striking in the week that I've been here. I've told people about the changes that are underway in the region at the moment and discussed it. And everybody says, wow, what a depressing picture that you paint, because I'm saying that there are changes taking place. And I think that has become very clear. What I was suggesting was that actually the mechanism, not about the actual politics, but the mechanism that brought about a shift in South Africa was the beginning of a critique, an internal debate within that society that shifted some of those parameters and allowed people to step beyond the constraints of their earlier thinking and to try and think new thinking about how to process and how to manage change.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take two more questions. Gentleman, first gentleman on your right, basically, with his hand up. Yeah, same, and then the gentleman behind you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is just to reply to my brother who spoke over there about the lack of definition of terms. The reason why we don't understand it is because none of these terminologies have been defined by the people actually who espouse them in the first place, and deliberately so. My point is to Mr. Esposito. In his conclusion, he actually said that the Western governments have to leverage their authority or their whatever you want to call it in the Muslim world to bring about some sort of positive change. And then he raised several issues. One, human rights, rule of law, the treatment of minorities. If we look at human rights, there's only one word we need to mention, which is Guantanamo. The second word, two words we can mention, which is Abu Ghraib. When it comes to the rule of law, we can see that this country is doing away with the most fundamental and basic of traditions, habeas corpus, when it tries to bring in the 42-day detention in the UK. When it talks about treatment of minorities, the treatment of Muslims in the UK is very close to becoming to the treatment of Jews in Nazi Germany not too long ago. So I do not think the West has any right or has any leverage whatsoever to speak to the Muslim world and to tell them about good governance and civil society.
Yes, could you, I had a gentleman in the back had his hand up.
Good afternoon. I just would like at the beginning to say that I, and I'm sure that all other Muslims, appreciate your works and efforts that you've done in understanding the Muslim world, or particularly Islam. But don't you think that the actual fact that we are sitting here this afternoon and discussing the Islamic threat is a trap by itself? So basically, Islam, Muslims, jihadists, Islamists, all of these terms is actually, and all of this industry around it is actually brought to us in order to draw the attention away from the real problem or the real threat that feeds the alleged Islamic threat, which is the Zionist threat. Okay, so I just would like to understand why none of you spend his time in investigating the Zionist threat rather than the Islamist threat?
Can I just say, I mean, I'm going to speak as Demos here because we're obviously, the sponsors and the orchestrators of this particular debate. And you can take the position that discussing this is falling into a trap, or actually you can take our position, which is that it's actually about discussing the meaning of these words, actually investigating what we mean when we sometimes are careless with our vocabulary and what kind of impact that has on our general understanding of reality, whether we can do that and actually avoid falling into all sorts of much more dangerous traps. If having a conversation such as this one here is falling into a trap, then I would go along with this. I think it's very important that we do this. So I think that it's precisely what we need to do. I would like to just press actually the panel very quickly on this, which is that I am quite surprised that actually, possibly because we don't want to fall into a big semantic discussion here, which is absolutely okay, but do these words matter? I mean, does it matter, for example, that some of us refer to the Islamic threat, others to the Islamist threat, others more broadly about Islam and Muslims? There seems to be a general sliding around. We haven't addressed it. Does it matter that we haven't addressed it? Does it prevent us from telling the story, as some of you have said? Does it prevent us from constructing the alternative vision that, could replace the kind of stalemate that you refer to, Alistair? I wondered whether you had some thoughts on this.
Well, Alistair, go ahead.
I think, in response to the last comment, it's absolutely essential to try and rescue language from the abuse that it is being subjected to at the moment. We are not using language to communicate or to inform or to talk to one another. Language is being used primarily, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, to undermine and erode identity. It is being used as a tool of power in order to weaken, to make the identity of Islamists appear unattractive to young people living in the West or elsewhere, to say, well, why would you want to become backward? Why would you want to live in the 7th century? Why would you want to be incapable of dealing with the modern world? This type of language is deliberately used and abused in order to erode, identity and to used as a tool of power. So I think it's very important that we should be very careful about language, and we should try and rescue language from this and to try and give it a clearer meaning. And we should be very cautious about allowing people to use language like Islamofascism and totalitarianism unless there is a very clear description on their part of what they are trying to say with that and ability to defend it. But I think we are far too uncritical in allowing these words, terrorism, Islamofascism, and other words to be used. And we have to recuperate real meaning in language.
Thank you. Sumaya, would you like to add something to this?
I would agree with what Alistair said, and I think in the course of the war on terror, we saw the emergence of a language, a chaotic language with a lot of isms, and many of you here pointed to the isms. Isms like radicalism, jihadism, Islamism, and all these are terms which, rather than informing, rather than referring, they don't seem to refer, they don't seem to inform, they rather distort, and they're part of the problem, I believe. We're seeing the use of a slippery language. Slippery language that moves from Al-Qaeda to Muslims, from terrorism to Islam, and moves between Islam and Islamism, and reserves for itself the right to define this thing called Islamism. I mean, I don't know if you remember Martin Amos's famous interview where he championed the policy of mass punishment of the Muslim community, where he was talking, he claimed to have been talking about Islamists, and then he said, and they are reproducing at such an alarming rate that they will be, I don't know where he quoted the figure, but over 1 billion humans very shortly. I don't think he was referring to Islamists. I believe he was talking about Muslims. So this really does illustrate this, slippery language which vacillates between the two. And I think we're seeing a codified, a game of codification. So when you hear the word radicalism, you think Islam. When you hear the word terrorism, you think Islam. So you don't even have to say Islamic terrorism for you to understand that those who are meant and referred to are in fact Muslims. And I think this is part of the problem. I personally believe that all these terms are unhelpful. And for instance, when we talk about political Islam, which we're discussing here, I think the word Islamism has become too loaded. And I think especially that many forces, journalists and the so-called former extremists have hijacked the term and have really monopolized it and loaded it with all sorts of unhelpful connotations which stand as a barrier to any attempt to understand the term or the phenomenon on the ground with all its diversity, to analyze it objectively and rationally. So I think there is the terminological baggage we use is part of the problem and needs to be revised.
Thank you. I'm going to give two last comments, one to John and then one to Robert.
Well, very quickly, the first fellow who spoke, that was a very good speech. It wasn't a question. And I agree with everything you said by way of the speech. With regard to your observations on what I said, you totally misunderstand what I said. Because when I said America should walk the way it talks on self-determination and human rights, I wasn't saying that it should impose its notion of human rights on other countries. I was talking about America's policies when it comes to self-determination and human rights in the Middle East don't measure up. I was also saying when it came to aid to Muslim countries, which is going to be given, that rather than dealing with, approaching it with military intervention and with military aid, one should talk about economic development. With regard to words, let me point out to you there's a problem. We have to deal with language. So Islamofascism is out, and I've written on that. But for example, fundamentalism. We had a panel at a professional meeting 10 years ago. Everyone denounced the term fundamentalism, including the organizer. What no one knew is the next day I was speaking at the organizer's university, and he advertised Islamic fundamentalism. I said, why? He said, because people won't show up if I use a more esoteric word. That's the word they're used to. This panel is important, not because some of you who are Muslim and subscribe to a certain understanding, you don't need to deal with this question of, is there an Islamist threat? But the broader population is every day subject to that language. And so, for example, that's what'll pull them in. Or if you put it on a book. When I wrote my book, Islamic Threat, Myth, or Reality, some of my Muslim friends said, oh, how could you say? I said, I want the people who believe that there is an Islamic threat to take it home and read it. I'm not looking for the other side. So be realistic. Finally, on the word Islamist, I turned down a book that I reviewed for a publisher because the first person to ever use the word Islamist, the book was published. Okay? There are now Muslims in the Muslim world who say, Usuliyah, they go for fundamentalism. There are Muslims in the Muslim world who say, we prefer Islamist, it's more accurate. Islamist is a problem, that term. But the fact is, no matter how we change the term, political Islam came in because people didn't want to use fundamentalism. They didn't want the bias of fundamentalism. But political Islam is a problem if you're talking about a social movement that may or may not be political. But we're never going to get the perfect word.
Thank you. Robert.
Yeah. As one who has been trying to oppose terms like Islamofascism, I have to say that the questions I have just heard are profoundly depressing. I think that the questioners, many of them, are using are making the kind of abusive language, the kind of broad brush strokes, the kind of ill-informed generalizations that they're protesting against. I really think that if someone like Martin Bright or one of the people who follow him were to come and listen to this, they would go away feeling that the people who use terms like Islamofascism had a point. I have the feeling that if they heard some of these questions, some of the people that you're worried about would be reinforced and strengthened. So it's discouraging, I have to say. And I'm saying it as someone who has tried to tell the story of the Muslim Brotherhood and others, and who has received a lot of abuse from it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, two quick things. One is that we're becoming a threat to the next event, so we're being kicked out. And the second is that Alistair helpfully pointed out an opening quote in the current editorial in Cultures of Resistance that is by George Orwell. And it goes like this: if thought corrupts language, then language can also corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should and do know better. So I think that encapsulates very much the challenge ahead. I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's been a real treat. And to thank my panel, Alistair, Robert, Sumaya, and John. Thank you.